In 1945, Europe was reduced to rubble. Entire cities were flattened, economies were shattered, and governments were in total collapse. The global hierarchy that had dictated world politics for centuries was effectively erased. Out of that physical and political void, only two nations emerged with the industrial capacity and military strength to project power on a global scale: the United States and the Soviet Union. But these two superpowers were operating on entirely different ideological wavelengths. Following the 1917 Russian Revolution, the Soviets had built a state defined by collective ownership and strict central control. This system stood in direct contrast to American free market capitalism and individual liberty. For a few years, they fought on the same side, but their alliance during the Second World War was born out of pure necessity to defeat Nazi Germany, rather than any shared vision for the future. Once that mutual enemy was destroyed, the ideological rift between Washington and Moscow was laid bare. They looked across the ruins of Europe and saw only a heavily armed, entirely untrustworthy rival. The tension was palpable as the former allies met at a series of post-war conferences. The stated goal was to map out the division of territories and figure out how to rebuild the continent. But the negotiations were instantly unbalanced. America had successfully tested the atomic bomb. They now held a weapon capable of leveling entire cities in a single blast, giving them absolute military superiority. Stalin's intelligence network had already alerted him to the weapon, but its existence on the negotiating table confirmed his worst fears. The peace process quickly devolved into a race to secure defenses against an existential threat. Looking at this map of post-war Europe, we can see Stalin's strategy taking shape. To protect his borders from future Western invasions, he established puppet governments across Eastern Europe, expanding Soviet influence westward to create a physical buffer zone. Western leaders watched these communist regimes take hold and interpreted the move as blatant empire building. Winston Churchill famously declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, dividing Europe in two. Fearing that starving, desperate populations in Western Europe might vote communist regimes into power, the United States announced the Truman Doctrine. This established a policy of containment, aggressively pushing back against the spread of Soviet influence. To make this strategy work, America implemented the Marshall Plan, sending $12 billion in economic aid to rapidly rebuild Western European economies. Stalin watched this influx of Western capital and saw an economic trap designed to encircle the Soviet Union. In response, he forced the Eastern Bloc to reject the aid and created his own rival economic recovery system, known as Comecon. By building these geographic and financial shields to protect themselves, both superpowers guaranteed the exact outcome they feared: a deeply hostile, entirely divided continent. The political hostility soon bled into physical confrontation. Deep inside the Soviet-controlled zone, the city of Berlin was split between the Allies. To force the West out, Stalin blockaded all supply routes into the western half of the city. Instead of retreating or forcing a ground war, the Western Allies organized the Berlin Airlift. They systematically flew thousands of tons of supplies directly over Soviet lines to keep the city alive until the blockade was finally lifted. But the brief relief of that victory evaporated in 1949 when the Soviet Union successfully detonated its own atomic weapon. The United States no longer had a nuclear monopoly. Simultaneously, the ideological map shifted dramatically in Asia. Following decades of civil war, Mao Zedong's communist forces secured victory in China, aligning the world's most populous nation with the Soviet Union. This momentum spilled over into the Korean Peninsula. When communist North Korean forces invaded the South, the United Nations and the United States deployed troops. This became a brutal proxy war, where American soldiers actively fought to stop communist expansion. With direct clashes occurring on the ground, Both sides rushed to expand their arsenals, rapidly upgrading from atomic weapons to vastly more destructive hydrogen bombs. What began as a diplomatic stalemate in Europe had morphed into a heavily militarized global standoff. Direct conflict between the superpowers now carried the guarantee of mutually assured destruction. As new leadership took the helm, Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow and John F. Kennedy in Washington, the risk of global annihilation pushed the conflict into the shadows. Covert espionage became the primary tool for gaining an edge. The United States relied heavily on high-altitude U-2 spy planes to photograph Soviet military installations. When one of these planes was shot down over Russian airspace in 1960, it shattered any remaining illusions of diplomatic trust. This competition extended into orbit. The Soviets shocked the world by launching Sputnik, a first artificial satellite, sparking a frantic technological sprint for dominance in space. Yet beneath the surface of these technological triumphs, a massive economic gap was widening. While Western nations experienced rapid economic growth fueled by capitalism, the centrally planned economies of the Eastern Bloc struggled to provide basic goods to their citizens. The stark contrast was most visible in Berlin. Given the option to cross into the prosperous West, millions of East German citizens simply packed up and left, draining the Eastern Bloc of its labor force and threatening the collapse of the Soviet economy. To stop this mass exodus, the Soviet leadership took drastic action. In August 1961, citizens awoke to find Berlin physically divided by barbed wire and guards. This barrier quickly evolved into a towering concrete wall, built specifically to trap East Berliners inside. Tensions peaked at the border crossing known as Checkpoint Charlie. For 16 hours, heavily armed US and Soviet tanks faced each other just yards apart, idling on the razor edge of starting World War III, before both sides slowly backed away. The Cold War didn't stem from a single declaration of malice. It was the product of a relentless security dilemma. Every attempt by one side to defend itself was perceived as a mortal threat by the other, feeding a cycle of paranoia that ultimately trapped half of Europe behind a wall of concrete.